When people talk about Formula One, they're talking about a sport that's been around for over 70 years, dominated by European teams and predominantly white drivers. But then someone came along and changed literally everything. And I mean everything. Lewis Hamilton didn't just win races, he fundamentally transformed what it means to be a Formula One driver, and honestly, what it means for motorsport to matter in today's world. Over the next few minutes, I'm going to walk you through how one person managed to shatter records that people thought were untouchable, become the first driver in Formula One history, and somehow convince an entire sport to take a hard look at itself. But here's the thing that most people miss. It wasn't just about winning. It was about everything that came with those wins and what he chose to do with that platform. So stick around, because we're breaking down exactly how Lewis Hamilton rewrote the Formula One history books and honestly made the entire sport impossible to ignore. Let me start with the numbers, because they're absolutely staggering. We're talking about 105 Grand Prix victories. 105 times this guy crossed the finish line first while driving a car at speeds that most of us can't even comprehend. To put that in perspective, Michael Schumacher held the record with 91 wins, and people thought that number was literally untouchable. They said it would stand for decades. It didn't. Hamilton blew past it and kept going. Then there are the pole positions, 104 of them. That's starting from the front row of the grid more times than anyone else in the history of the sport. When you're consistently putting your car in pole position, you're not just winning races occasionally, you're showing a level of precision and consistency that's borderline superhuman. And then there are the World Drivers' Championships, 7 of them. 7! Michael Schumacher had 7. When Hamilton tied that record, the motorsport world literally held its breath. But he didn't stop there. That's the thing about Lewis. He had a way of setting benchmarks that seemed impossible, then surpassing them like they were nothing. The 2008 season is where this all started, and honestly, it's one of the most remarkable debuts in sports history. This young kid from Stevenage, England showed up to his first Formula One season driving for McLaren, and he finished second in the championship as a rookie. Second. Most drivers would celebrate that for years, but it set the tone for what was coming. Then came the championship years, 2014, 2015, 2017, 2018, 2019, 2020. 6 consecutive titles at one point. That's not just dominance, that's establishing a complete and total mastery of the sport. And what makes this even more interesting is that he did it with one team, Mercedes, and he did it during an era when that particular team had advantages that made them nearly unstoppable. But here's where people get it wrong. Hamilton wasn't just benefiting from a superior car, he was actively helping build that superiority through his technical feedback and collaboration. But we'll get to that in a second. What really fascinates me about Hamilton's era is that while he was breaking every statistical record imaginable, he was simultaneously doing something that Formula One drivers simply didn't do. He was talking about real things, about issues that mattered. Historically, and I mean for decades, Formula One drivers were expected to be these apolitical figures. You show up, you drive, you don't make waves, you certainly don't talk about anything controversial. It was just the culture of the sport. Drivers were seen as entertainers, yes, but not as activists or voices for social change. Lewis Hamilton essentially said no to that narrative. During the 2020 season, he started a very public and very vocal campaign for racial equality. This wasn't subtle stuff either. We're talking about taking a knee before races, wearing custom helmets with messages about justice, speaking openly about his experiences as the only driver on the grid. And here's the thing that really got people's attention. He forced Formula One to confront something the sport had been ignoring for years. The lack of diversity wasn't accidental, it was systemic. It was baked into the culture, into the pathways that young drivers take to get into the sport, into the teams, into everything. For a long time, F1 pretended this wasn't a problem. Then, Lewis Hamilton, one of the most successful athletes in the history of the sport, essentially said, no, actually, we're going to talk about this. The entire sport had to listen. And what happened next was significant. Formula One launched initiatives aimed at increasing diversity and inclusion. Teams started paying attention to recruitment in different communities. The conversation changed. You could argue about whether these changes went far enough or moved fast enough, but the point is the conversation happened because Hamilton made it impossible to ignore. Beyond the activism, there's also the foundation work. Mission 44. That's Hamilton's charitable organization, and its entire focus is on supporting young people from underrepresented backgrounds in STEM and motorsport. Think about that for a second. He's not just racing and winning, he's actively working to create pathways for the next generation of diverse talent in a sport that historically hadn't made space for them. That's not just athlete activism, that's using your resources and platform to systematically change the landscape of your sport. And I think that's the part of his legacy that might actually be more important than any individual race victory. Now, let's talk about something that probably sounds weird when you're talking about a Formula One driver, but fashion and music. But this is actually crucial to understanding how Lewis Hamilton changed the sport's entire cultural footprint. Traditionally, Formula One existed in this bubble. It was a sport for wealthy Europeans who understood motorsport and appreciated the technical complexity of racing. It was niche, it was exclusive. It was, if I'm being honest, a little bit boring to mainstream audiences.
Who didn't grow up around racing culture? Lewis Hamilton changed that by being unapologetically himself. The guy's genuinely interested in high fashion. He attends fashion weeks, he collaborates with designers, he wears bold, creative outfits that would have gotten previous F1 drivers laughed out of the paddock. He's deeply involved in music culture. He's friends with musicians, he produces music, he understands the intersection between celebrity and sports in a way that previous drivers didn't. And here's what happened because of that. Formula One became cool in a completely different way. Suddenly, it wasn't just about the technical specifications of the cars and the historical traditions of the sport. It was about personality. It was about watching someone who was talented, successful, and also culturally relevant in spaces outside of motorsport. That sounds like a small thing, but it genuinely changed who watches Formula One. The average age of F1 viewers dropped dramatically. The social media engagement exploded. Young people who would have never considered watching a motorsport event started tuning in because Lewis Hamilton made it accessible and culturally interesting. He did this primarily through platforms like Instagram and TikTok, engaging with audiences in ways that previous drivers never did. You're not just watching a driver, you're getting glimpses into his life, his style, his interests, his personality. That fundamentally altered the entertainment value proposition of Formula One. And I think that's actually genius from a sports perspective. He made the sport matter to people who didn't think they cared about racing. That's significant. Now, let's rewind to 2013, because something happened that year that seemed absolutely insane at the time. Lewis Hamilton left McLaren for Mercedes, and I want to emphasize how crazy this seemed to everyone watching at that moment. McLaren was a legendary team. They had just signed a partnership with Honda. Everyone assumed this was the smart move, the prestigious move, the move that would set Hamilton up for the next era of dominance. Mercedes at that time wasn't viewed as a championship team. They had won championships, sure, but they weren't the obvious choice for an elite driver. The criticism was immediate and brutal. People were saying he'd made a catastrophic mistake. They were saying he was washed up, that he'd thrown away his career, that Mercedes couldn't compete at the highest level. What actually happened was the complete opposite, and it's one of the most fascinating examples of how a driver can shape a team's direction. Hamilton brought this meticulous, detailed approach to technical feedback. He would work with the engineers, collaborate on setup, provide incredibly specific information about what the car needed to do to perform optimally. Mercedes, for their part, built a team culture around technical excellence and iterative improvement. The combination of Hamilton's feedback and the team's willingness to listen and innovate created what became the most dominant era in Formula One history. During the turbo hybrid era, Mercedes was basically in a different league. They weren't just competitive, they were operating at a level that frequently made the outcome of races feel predetermined. That's not to say it was boring. Hamilton's racecraft was too good for that. But it's fair to say that Mercedes' technological and strategic advantages were substantial. This is where people sometimes criticize Hamilton, saying that his records are inflated because of the car he was driving. But here's what people miss. Hamilton actively contributed to building that car's superiority. He wasn't just benefiting from the work of engineers, he was helping shape the direction of the team's development. That's a different thing. A driver can have the best car in the world and still not win if they don't have the skill, the mental fortitude, and the ability to extract every possible advantage. Hamilton demonstrated all of that consistently for years. But the Mercedes story doesn't end there, because later in his career, Hamilton made another controversial move. He signed with Ferrari. Ferrari, the most iconic team in Formula One history, a team that hadn't won a championship since 2007, a team that seemed genuinely cursed when it came to finding drivers who could deliver at the highest level. Again, everyone had opinions. People wondered if he was slowing down, if this was a desperate attempt to revitalize a career that was supposedly winding down, if he'd lost his competitive edge. But I think what people missed was the competitive challenge that motivated the move. At Mercedes, he'd achieved everything: 7 championships, record-breaking statistics, complete and total dominance. The question that probably drove him to Ferrari was simple. Could he still compete at the highest level? Could he take a team that hadn't won in nearly 2 decades and build something special? That's not a move someone makes if they're satisfied or slowing down. That's a move someone makes because the competitive fire is still burning, and they're looking for a new mountain to climb. Let me step back for a moment and talk about what I think is actually the most important part of Hamilton's impact on Formula One. Because the records and the championships are easy to measure, but this thing is harder to quantify. He fundamentally changed the narrative around what it means to be a Formula One thriver. For most of the sport's history, the narrative was about being a neutral, apolitical, technical expert focused solely on racing. Drivers were discouraged to have opinions, from expressing themselves, from being political, from being cultural figures. Lewis Hamilton walked into that world and said, "I'm going to be all of those things. I'm going to be a technical master of racing, yes, but I'm also going to use my platform to talk about things that matter to me.
I'm going to be interested in fashion, music, social justice, the environment. I'm not going to compartmentalize my life into racing Lewis and everything else Lewis. I'm just going to be Lewis." And by doing that, he essentially gave permission to the entire sport to be more human, more expressive, more real. That sounds like it should be obvious, but in the context of Formula One's culture, it was genuinely revolutionary. Younger drivers coming up now see Hamilton's example and understand that you don't have to be a robot to be a world champion. You can have personality, interests, opinions, and still excel at the highest level of sport. That's a legacy that's probably more significant than any championship or record. When you look at where Formula One is today compared to where it was before Lewis Hamilton started his career, the differences are stark. The sport is more diverse. Still not where it needs to be, but genuinely more diverse. The conversation around inclusion is happening openly and seriously in a way it simply wasn't before. The cultural reach of the sport has expanded dramatically, with fans ranging from traditional motorsport enthusiasts to people who discovered F1 through social media and celebrity culture. The business landscape of the sport has changed because Hamilton made F1 marketable to demographics that previously weren't interested. Teams now invest more heavily in social media, in celebrity partnerships, in cultural relevance. That's a direct result of Hamilton showing that there was commercial value in being more than just a racing driver. And perhaps most importantly, the sport has learned that great athletes don't have to be silent. They can drive at the highest level and also have meaningful things to say about the world around them. They can be champions and activists simultaneously. That's not a distraction from their sport, it's an expansion of what athletic excellence can mean. I think that's genuinely the most important thing Lewis Hamilton did for Formula One. He didn't just break records and win races, he expanded what was possible within the sport, what was allowed, what was expected. And he did it not by revolutionary gestures or by trying to destroy the sport and rebuild it from scratch, but by simply being himself and being excellent at what he does. Sometimes that quiet revolution is the most powerful kind. That's really what changed Formula One forever.